In this section, I'm talking to you about a number of trend line trade setups I like. And the first one is the gap either above or below a trend line. And the second one is what I call the retest. Now if you look at this price chart right here, this is a price chart of soybean oil. And the trend line I'm focused on is simply a very simple trend line connecting one high to another high. Now what I call this situation right here is a retest, and this is what my second favorite trend line trade setup is. It's when prices penetrate the trend line, as they did here, and then come back down and test it. Now the way I like to trade this is, rather than be a buyer down in this point here, I usually like to wait until the high of the move that preceded the test is penetrated. So in this instance, I would have waited for prices to trade back through this high right here. But again, it's a very simple trade setup, and in this instance, this is what I call a single trend line retest. And this is what I mean. Here's my initial trend line, one high, a number two high. Here's the trend line. Prices come up through it, and then come back down and test it. When prices trade back through the high of the move here, the high of the initial breakout, that's when I like to go long in this instance with a stop at the low. That's a very simple single trend line retest. Let me show you another example. Okay, here's a stock, price chart of a stock, and here's a high here with another high here, and it's just a very simple trend line, very basic. But notice how prices penetrate this trend line. More importantly, notice that the lows of these two price bars are above the trend line. And if you recall from a previous section, what constitutes a valid trend line break? When the lows or highs of a price bar are actually above or below the trend line. I don't like to just work solely off a close above or below a trend line. I actually like to see the highs and lows of the price bar work up themselves above or below the trend line. So what we do have here is a legitimate trend line break. So, as simply put, I'm looking to go long if prices can trade back above these highs here. And as you can see, we came back down very briefly, tested the upper portion of the trend line, and then that's when prices began to rally. This is a single trend line retest. And momentarily I'll be showing you a dual or a double trend line retest. But this is the second trend line trade setup that I really focus on and find a lot of reliability in. But again, here's just a simple trend line connecting two extremes, two highs. Prices move through them, break above them. The lows of the price bar are above the trend line, thereby confirming a legitimate trend line break. We come back down, test the trend line, and then trade higher. So my buy orders are going to be above the extremes here, with my initial protective stop right here at the low. This worked out to be a very nice trade. Let me show you another example. And again, this is a single line retest. Here's a very simple trend line, one high to another high. Prices trade above it, and you can see the low of these two bars are indeed above the trend line, constituting what I believe is a legitimate trend line breakout. Prices come back to the downside and begin turning up. So my orders to the buy side are going to be on a break of these highs right here. My protective stop, or my initial protective stop, will be a low of the move right here. And as you can see, this was in the Canadian dollar, and this did indeed signal a sizable move up in prices, all based off a simple use of a trend line. Simply put, a pencil and a ruler. Now let me show you what I consider a dual test. Okay, here we have another stock, and let me expand the chart a bit. Okay, we have a simple trend line drawn from two highs, this high and this high. Prices trade above it, closing price action above the trend line. The lows of these two price bars are above the trend line, so that constitutes, again, a legitimate trend line breakout. Prices come back down once. This would be a single line retest. They bounce up and then come back down again. This is what I call a dual or a double trend line retest. Here's your first retest. Here's your second retest. Now, under the rules I tend to follow under a single trend line retest would be I would take a trade if prices trade back above the high of the original breakout. On a dual test like this, I wait for the intermediate or the interim high to be taken out, as it was right here. And my initial protective stop would be the low of the second retest. So again, here's our initial trend line breakout. We come back down, test it once, bounce, come back down, test it twice. Again, hence a dual trend line retest. So I know that if prices can break above this point right here, I'd like to be long the market with an initial protective stop at the low here. Let me show you a few more examples just to make sure I'm making my point clear. Here again, just a very simple trend line. And this is a stock connecting two highs. Prices trade through it. The lows of the bars are above the trend line. We come back down once. Here's my initial retest. Come back down a second time. Here's my dual test. So the interim high here is where I'd actually like to be long the market with a stop at the low or the extreme of the second retest. Again, it's a very simple trend line technique, and it's a very simple trend line trade setup, but a very effective trend line trade setup, as you can see with regard to this single issue here. Let me show you another example. And this is going to be a dual trend line trade setup. Here's my two extremes, here and here. Prices trade through the line. The low of the bar is above the trend line, so I believe in this instance that I have a legitimate trend line breakout. Prices come back down, test it once. They bounce. We don't take out this extreme. Here's the bounce, and we come back down and test that trend line again. Again, in this instance here, this is a dual trend line retest trade setup. Once prices trade back through this level here, I'd like to be long the market, and my initial protective stop will be the extreme of the second retest. And again here, a simple high here. Here's another extreme here. You can see prices trading above the line. The lows of the bars are above the line. So again, this is a high probability trend line break, or what I consider to be a legitimate trend line break. Prices come back down, test the line here. They seem to pull back one more time here, not necessarily reaching the low, but in this instance you can either have had your entry above the extreme of the bounce or the extreme of the original breakout. But I would tend to think this would be a dual trend line retest here. Here's your first, and here's your second. And of course, if initiated on the position, I like to make the extreme of the second retest my initial protective stop. And this was the Japanese yen all session, and as you can see, again, it did indeed introduce a very nice sizable trade. And again, here's another simple dual trend line retest trade setup. Here's my initial high. Here's my secondary point where I'm drawing the low from. Prices trade above the line. The lower the bars are above the line. We come down once, test the trend line. We come down a second time and test the trend line. So once prices penetrate the intervening swing high here, I'm long the market against the extreme of the second retest. And as you can see, in this stock, that introduced a price move that took prices from $45 a share all the way up to $75. So these are my two favorite trend line trade setups. Either a gap above or below a trend line, and the trend line retest is an excellent trade setup. Either a single or a dual retest. And the way I've outlined them, you have kind of a rule of thumb or a guideline with regard to what would be the trigger following a setup and what would be the initial protective stop following a setup. I hope you find a lot of value in this, and these are some setups I've worked with for a number of years, and again, I find them very highly reliable. These are not the only trendline trade setups or trade setups that trend lines offer, but these are the two most reliable that I tend to work with the most and really like. And I hope you find them equally valuable as I have.